Hey Simon, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm looking forward to our conversation today. It's going to be all about language and how language makes us human, how it influences our thoughts and our consciousness, and just everything that's going on about it. And so, hope maybe we can start off with just a little bit about you and, where does your fascination and your learnership of language come from?
Well, to be honest, it's entirely accidental. I did languages at school like everybody does to some extent, and I more or less completely hated it. I didn't understand the point of it. I didn't like the way it was taught. I couldn't learn it. I had no interest. But when I was about 19, before going to university, I wanted to just get out of England and go somewhere, anywhere, basically. And the only thing that offered that was easy to do was going to a kibbutz on Israel. And so I spent 6 months there, and 3 months of that was working with children in a hospital sort of environment who didn't speak English. And I had to kind of immerse myself in learning Hebrew. And I discovered to my astonishment that actually I could do it. In context, in an environment where it makes sense, and you're seeing why people are using the words they do. It's much easier to learn than having some guy writing stuff on a blackboard and trying to figure out obscure grammatical relations that don't make any sense. So that was my first exposure to a proper, foreign language environment, perhaps. And then I also fell in love with an Israeli nurse, and we had an affair, and that helps too, to motivate you.
Yeah.
But that was kind of it. And then I went back to university, and I didn't study language. I was studying English literature, really. But I became interested in Japan, mainly because I took up a thing called Aikido, which is a martial art. And by the time I got out of university, I just felt the one thing I wanted to find out more about was Aikido, and I needed to go to Japan to do that. So I managed to find a way to do that. But I didn't, again, really think that I was going to learn Japanese. That just seemed like an impossible task. And I'd expected that I was going to find enough people who would speak English, and I'd somehow be able to, manage that way. But it very quickly became clear that wasn't the case. So I was teaching in a school. I was like 13, 14-year-olds who they had as much interest in learning language as I had when I was 13 or 14. So basically I had to learn Japanese in order to teach them English, and I succeeded and they didn't. So really I kind of just fell into it and discovered that it wasn't as hard as I had thought. And then one thing led to another. I sort of decided I needed to learn to read. I joined a translation company, and then I qualified as an interpreter, and sort of here I am kind of thing. So I've learned it from the ground up rather than from the top down, which in my experience of talking to other people and dealing with other, people who've learned languages in different ways, and particularly Japanese, it seems a better way to do it, because essentially we learn language from our ears. We don't learn it from our eyes. As children, you hear it. It comes into you through your ears. It doesn't come in through your eyes. So whilst it is useful to be able to read a language, a foreign language, that does help, obviously, especially at the advanced stages. If you want to develop a good pronunciation and a good feel for the language, there's nothing better than being thrown in the deep end, I think. Tough though it is.
Yeah. Tough is the right word. I can't imagine being in a situation where no one speaks the language that I speak and trying to figure out how to get about, and you're just left with no choice but to learn. And I know lots of people who have done similar sorts of things, and they say the first few months are rough. but you eventually you just have to pick it up, right? You adapt, and
Yeah,
we have this amazing capacity to take on new languages, and it evolves, and then all of a sudden you're thinking in that language if you're there for long enough.
I know it is an amazing thing, but the thing about it is you're basically back to being a baby. When you were born, you didn't have language, and you slowly pick it up, and it takes several years for a child to get up to speed with its own language. But the difference with coming at it from an adult is that you already know what you should be able to do. You have this great expectation that you can express yourself in the finest of detail using language, and suddenly you can't, and it's incredibly frustrating not to be able to say what you want to say. Whereas a baby doesn't even have that expectation, and so you just it's a gradual process of expanding your consciousness, essentially. But for an adult, you're fighting that terrible battle of wanting to be able to say how you think it ought to be said, and realizing you can't say it like that. And even worse, the fact that you're expecting it to be a certain way makes it harder for you to actually understand how it is. I remember particularly...
Yeah, it's almost like your capacity, but you're unable to fulfill it, right? And
that's right.
Your wish to communicate, and it's just not there.
Yeah, and even when you do, one thing that always sticks in my mind is that one of the early things that you need to know as any speaker of any language is how to say you must do something, or I must do something. It's that relationship between yourself and the world. The necessity of doing something you must. It's a very key word, and in English it's a very simple word, must. And when I discovered how you say it in Japanese, it's incredibly convoluted. If you translate it literally, it means it will not do if you do not do that, right? Shinakereba narimasen. Sore shinakereba narimasen. It's like, what? That's must? No, it can't be. Yeah. And I remember at that point, I just thought, this language is impossible. And I just threw my grammar book away, and I thought, that's it. I just can't do that. That's too much. But after about 3 months, because I was in an environment where people are speaking Japanese around me all the time, of course, you very quickly, not quickly, but you start to hear it being said, shinakereba narimasen, and you think, well, you don't think, it's just that it becomes part of you. And then when I went back to my grammar book 3 months later and I saw, shinakereba narimasen, yeah, I've got that one. It's it's the problem of sort of trying to get your own culture out of the way, get your own expectations about language out of the way, and just let it come to you. And the brain is a remarkable tool, it's just a pattern recognition device, and if you give it a chance, it'll spot the new patterns quite easily.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's, our brains are pattern recognizers, and language is a series of patterns, and organized in a particular way for that particular purpose, I suppose. And, you actually go into this quite a lot in your book as well, where it's like, if we're talking about, okay, so like if we look at the origins of language, right, based on the research that you've done, and your own experiences with it, there's a sort of typical trend, I suppose, in evolutionary science that suggests that, well, language seems to have evolved from something like apes just making sounds and then being able to recognize that those sounds correspond or symbolize certain objects, and then when you expand that enough, it develops into a more I think the way you phrase it is you go from analog to digital, right? So is that your sort of understanding of it? I mean, I don't think I did a very good job explaining it.
Yeah, well, I think before I come to that specifically, I think the thing to sort of get out there is that the current understanding of how language evolved basically says, well, when our brains got to a certain size, they became language ready, and then we were able to speak. I mean, that's the classic Chomsky position. He said back in the 50s, he said, well, there must have been something that changed in our brains. There must have been what he called, a mutation. But, he said there's something in our brains called a language acquisition device. I mean, he didn't mean a little gadget. He meant just a biological change, something that allowed us to understand grammar. And one day that just happened. And in one individual suddenly was able to process grammar. And then that got passed on, and we all learned to speak. But the point is, and this is still the case in even if you think about it in less specific terms to grammar, that our brain needed to be ready for language, and that other animals' brains are not ready for language. Now, I was listening to, you did an interview with David Sloan Wilson a while back, and he expressed it classically. He said, that the difference between us and all other animals is that we have a capacity for symbolic thinking, right? Somehow we have a capacity for symbolic thinking. It's never explained how we might have got that thing, but and also, we cooperate. We have this ability to cooperate. Okay, where did we get this abstract ability to cooperate from? So I was reading all this stuff and I was thinking, okay, that's sort of theoretically plausible if we actually found something in the brain that would correspond to something that might look like that. But we've never found anything like that. And how would you, in any case, just develop an abstract symbolic thinking? It's sort of something that seems very implausible. Well, it seemed implausible to me. So I started thinking, well, the issue is not really grammar. I mean, grammar is the problem that we all confront when we're trying to learn a foreign language, especially in a classroom. They tell you all about grammar, and it's very complex. But if you go back to the person who's trying to learn a language from the ground up on the street, you don't start with grammar, you start with words. You need a word. You have to know how to say water or food or bed or just the very basic things that you need to survive. You start with words, and only when you've got a certain number of words do you ever need grammar. Because, I mean, for example, I can speak a handful of words of Greek, for example, but I don't have enough words of Greek to need to use grammar because I just don't have enough words of it. So language doesn't begin with grammar, it begins with words. So the question is really, where do words come from? And I'd known for some time that let's frame back a little bit, sorry, but words are made up of phonemes, right? They're what linguists call phonemes, what ordinary people call vowels and consonants. It's just the noises that we need, and there's a set number of them. I don't know if you know how many there are in English, but it's 44. I'll spare you the trouble. Yeah. Whereas Japanese, for example, has only 20. Now, I started to realize that there's this discrepancy between the number of sounds that any language uses, and it ranges from as many as 150 when you get into click languages, down to only 11 in the jungles of South America as a tribe there. So we don't actually need to have all these sounds, but somehow we must have started with a lot of sounds, and what we've done is we learned to put them together. And then that thought was what really opened it up for me. I suddenly thought, that's how you start, because if you look at how animals communicate, they make noises. You have 2 dogs, right? And they communicate with each other, right? They bark and woof, and they can sort of indicate their mood by using noise. Well, that's what we do, and that's what we started with. And every animal does that. Well, all mammals do. So the problem for a dog and for a cow or a horse or whatever is that they've only got a very small number of noises they can make. So they can't really attach sounds to different meanings because they don't have enough sounds. So if you think, what would be the first step towards words? Well, it is combining sounds together so that you then, in combination, have a much greater range of different noises that you can make. And that's the beginning of language. And I characterize that as a digitization, because the dog's going woof. It's just a holistic noise. It doesn't break down into WOOF like it would if we were writing it. It's just a woof. And a moo is a moo. But if you were to say woof moo, you could then say moo woof is different. And if you've got three noises, you can put them together and you can make combinations of different sounds that gives you a wide vocabulary. And that would be the start of communication, because it would allow you to reference more things.
Right. So if I'm understanding you correctly, it's like all animals are able, mammals, let's say, make sounds, right?
Yeah.
And they make sounds to communicate, not just for the sake of making sounds.
Absolutely.
And for lots of different reasons. And you can sort of just think about it in terms of like, you know, a monkey that has a particular screech for a predator, or you know, different thing like that. I mean, even with my dogs, like I know when you spend enough time with dogs, you know the different barks that they make, what they're indicating, which is a very strange thing. But you can tell if it's a like threat bark, or if it's just a hello, or like who's at the door, or just I want food or something like that. And you know, they're just sort of slight variations, I suppose, on the same sound. But what's interesting is that, as you say, so if we have a limited number of sounds, phonemes, right? If you have 2, you can make 4 combinations with it, right? And if you have 3, you can make 9. It's an exponential.
Absolutely. Yes, exponential
growth.
Yeah.
And so, and very, very quickly, that gets really, really big numbers.
That's right.
With like 11, I don't even know what it is, but it's probably at least tens of thousands of different possibilities.
That's the
never
point.
mind 150. But what I want to know is like, okay, so, you know, early humans, let's say, because I think you're right. I think that the start of language would have had to have started with sounds. But there also would have had to have been this aspect of, well, the specific sounds have to represent certain things, and we have to have an ability to hold all that information together and make sense of it, right? And beyond that, to be able to come up with new ones, or different ones, or more abstract ones, you know? Because also sounds sometimes represent concepts, not just a specific thing. Like, and animals can do that too, right? Like there's probably a threat system, but it's not, I mean, a threat sound, but it's not specific to a particular kind of threat. It's like, it's probably, you know, more like run or something like that, if we had to translate it, or hide, or whatever, some verb like that, as opposed to like, oh, there's a lion there, you know, 50 meters away, everyone run.
Well, it probably just means danger, you know, danger.
Yeah, danger, right.
You decide from the situation what's the best thing to do here, you know?
Yeah. Or you don't, and you decide afterwards, because it's better to not have to think about it first, right? You got to protect yourself first. Okay, and then so grammar comes in later, because when you have a certain number of words, let's say, well, you need a way to structure and organize them syntactically in order to have communication be consistent.
Well, to express the relationship between things, that's the thing. Once you've got a certain number of objects that you've agreed on that a certain noise is associated with, like danger or food or sex or whatever, then you need a way to show the relationship between things, and that's the beginning of grammar. But just to go back to your point about, you know, how do we go from just having simple sounds to developing the ability to discriminate more finely? The beauty of the idea of starting at a very simple point of just combining sounds is that once you've got that going, then it allows you to start sharing ideas very simply. Like, you know, there's water over there, or, you know, whatever it is that you're conveying. So that means that every member of that community can share that knowledge. So the smartest individuals in that community are able to convey that knowledge to everybody else in their group, which means that there's an evolutionary advantage in being smart, not just for the individual, but for everybody in the group. So that means that then suddenly you have a driver for having a larger brain. Because
right, it's a selective pressure.
yeah,
I mean, an adaptive.
yeah, it's a
trait.
selective pressure, because there is no accepted explanation at the moment for why we have large brains. I mean, our brains are 3 times larger than chimpanzees. That happened over 3 million years, which seems like an awful long time, but in evolutionary terms, it's a very short time. So, whoa, we want to go for a
You
walk.
can hear. Yeah. I think someone just came home or something.
Okay.
Or they think so, at least. One of my dogs is deaf, so he just sometimes gets a feeling, right? And then he's like, is someone home? And then the other one's like, oh, I guess someone's home now. And then they just go off each other. Hey, shush, come here. Come, Gene. Hey, come. No one's here. So go ahead.
The interesting thing to me about thinking about language that way. Go on, you do.
You can keep going. I'm just shutting the door.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
The other interesting thing about thinking about the origin of language that way is that you get 2 for the price of 1. It gives you an explanation for why we have bigger brains, because the development of language and the ability to share ideas, even at a very primitive level, would give a selective advantage to people who were smarter. Because up until that time, essentially in nature, it's a struggle for existence. The strong ones tend to win out. I mean, obviously, a smarter individual will have an advantage, but that's only for that individual. It's not for the group. Whereas if you have language, it's a group advantage to have somebody who's smart and can share ideas.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's both advantageous for the individual and the group, right? Because for the individual, from let's say a sexual selection perspective, those members will be viewed as having some sort of higher value or higher status.
Absolutely.
Right? With this ability to conceptualize more abstractly. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm sure it also ties into this aspect of being able to think about and plan for future things, right? Because with an increase in our abstract reasoning and creative capacity, we can then start to make plans for the future.
Absolutely.
And in order to, and that gives you not an immediate advantage in the present, but certainly an advantage over a long period of time for both yourself and for the group at large.
Yeah. But it only becomes perceived by other people if you've got language to explain it. I mean, there's a certain level at which you could show some plans without language, but it's pretty damn limited. If you go back to the scenario we were talking about, you find yourself in a world where nobody speaks any language that you speak.
Right. Like mimicry can only get you so far.
Exactly so. Yeah.
Because lots of animals mimic each other, and it's some sort of primitive culture, and teach it to their younglings, but it's through sort of direct action and copying. But that's a lot more crude and difficult, I would say, than to be able to explain it.
And apart from anything else, they have no ability to talk about time. I mean, if we're talking about plans, we're talking about the future, we're talking about sort of having a way of thinking about time that isn't just sort of an abstract note. Well, isn't just anything. I mean, I wonder how your dogs think about time, for example. They may think, well, maybe I'm going to get a biscuit in some undefined moment in the future, but there's no sort of, they can't think about tomorrow very easily.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because, and it's a little bit, I guess, of for now, a chicken and egg kind of a question in terms of conceptualization of time, because I think, intuitively we kind of look at animals and say they're living in the moment, right? They're not really thinking about the future. They might experience things that are residual from the past. They've certainly learned behaviors and things like that from past experience, but future is a very different story. And it's one of the sort of one of the sides of the double-edged sword of being able to think about the future is we can make the best of it, or it also causes us to live in fear and worry about what all the bad things that might happen.
Yeah.
Right. And dogs and cats and whatever else, they don't seem to have that, right? They don't have general anxiety disorders and,
Right.
Depressive rumination episodes and things like that. And that's because, like, I mean, you would think that they certainly experience time, sort of, because...
Well, they know when it's time to be fed, right? They know when it's time to be fed.
Yeah, and oh my God, like remarkably accurately. And here's another thing. I mean, this is not exactly the same thing, but did you know that dogs can get jet lagged?
I did not.
Yeah, when we moved from South Africa to Canada, our dogs came with, and it's a 6-hour time difference, and they were jet lagged, and they were not happy about it. Shame. They would but it was just for a few days while it adjusted, right? But they would sleep like dead sleep during the day, and then they'd be up just cruising the house at night, just what's going on, where's the daytime kind of a thing.
Well, they probably have they probably have worse jet lag than humans do, because as you were saying, they have such an incredibly good body clock that functions very precisely in terms of their normal daily patterns. So if you take them out of that, their body clock is still the same, and they have nothing distracting them to tell them that it ought to be different. There's nobody saying, oh, you're going to have to wait another couple of hours before it's dinner tonight. They're just going, it's dinner time, or it's, so,
where's my food?
Yeah, so they probably have worse jet lag than humans do, actually.
Yeah, well, they certainly don't like daylight savings and that kind of stuff. Right. For that, when that transition happens, particularly when the hour jumps forward, and so it's sort of feeding time or whatever is an hour later, they don't like it, and they don't. I'm sure they don't understand it. And they at 5:30, they go and sit by the kitchen, and they're like, "Where's the food?"
Yeah.
And then it's it's complicated, but back to our sort of original point of the evolution of language. Now it's not exactly clear still, I guess, why that evolved. Right, there's still that original missing piece about why didn't it evolve for chimps? Why did it evolve for us? Kind of a thing. Yeah. What's your thought about that?
Well, my main thought about it is that, there's two things, I think. One is that we haven't really studied enough yet. We're starting to. I mean, it's happening in the last 10, 20 years maybe. More people are going into the field and looking more carefully at the way other animals communicate. So you can see slowly we're learning that other animals do have very, very primitive level, but they are combining sounds. There are species that we know that do that. And it's hardly advanced at all. It's very, very low level, but the phenomenon of learning to combine sounds to mean different things is out there. Now that's really important because that puts human language on a spectrum. And admittedly, it's the beginning stuff is just right at the very beginning. We're right on the other end of the hockey stick. It's an incredible, it's an exponential spectrum, but it is there. And the other side of that is, the thing about language is that once it gets going, it really takes off. And because all the advantages I just said to you, that, it's not just about the individual that benefits, the group benefits. And that, even though we're still talking millions of years, that's a very fast development. So why humans? That is an open question, and I can't answer that. All I can say is, this must be what happened. We did do that. We put the sounds together. We learned to do that. And that's how language develops. And that's potentially available to any other species, except that it's not something you can teach your dogs in their lifetime. We're talking hundreds of thousands of generations before that beds in. But that's still an awfully short time in evolutionary terms. I mean, if you think about human language, at the moment, there's, again, no agreed date for when we started to speak. People have all kinds of different estimates. I mean, the Chomsky school of thought, which is largely still the dominant one, says probably about 70,000 years ago, based on essentially the fact that there seems to have been some kind of big change in our tool-making abilities around about that time. And we sort of, that became more sophisticated. And you see art and things like that. So people say, oh, that must have been when we had language. But in order to have been doing art, we would have had to have had fairly sophisticated language anyway. So my idea is that it actually started a lot sooner than that it probably, as I said earlier, it makes more sense to think of language as being the driver for the growth in the brain. So that takes us back 2 to 3 million years even. So
yeah, and I suppose that sort of like 70,000 year mark is also, I mean, it feels like there's also some assumption of like some magic switch happening that sort of turned on.
Yeah.
Right. And all of a sudden we have language and we can do all these things, as opposed to the gradual approach of like, oh man, it took 2 million years to get to that point. And that's where we're starting to see the evidence for it.
That's right. And there's another very sort of simple proof that can't be right, which is that we know that humans have been burying themselves for much longer than that. I think the earliest sort of certain burial is about 140,000 years ago, but then they have in South Africa, about the caves where they found evidence that bodies have been buried deep in caves and things. And it's like, I think 600,000 years ago. Well, I mean, if you're going to the trouble of burying a body, that's not something you can do by yourself. And it's you need help to do that. Plus, you need a reason. It's like no animals bury themselves. They just don't do it. So for humans to have started burying themselves, it's almost impossible to imagine that would have happened unless we had some language going on. That we would have said, look, I don't think we want to leave Shane lying around there. It just doesn't look good. Let's cover him up. So, let's cover him up. Besides, there has to be a conversation, especially when you see that the bodies are marked with ritual, markings and things. That doesn't happen in a non-language environment. It can't. So 70,000 years has got to be wrong.
Because what's really interesting is that this line of reasoning sort of seems to suggest that language precedes meaning.
No, I don't think that. Okay, go on.
Not precedes is the wrong word, perhaps. It's that although we didn't need advanced language to know the meaning of things, right? Because we certainly don't need to know the meaning of everything in order to interact in the world, and we most of the time don't. And oftentimes meaning is just presented as sort of very roughly as, let's say, like danger, right? Like you hear a rustling in the bushes, you don't go, what's that? It could be anything, you just run, because it's better to be safe and alive than, smart and dead.
Yeah.
And so you might say, well, there's meaning that you've attached to that sound.
Right.
Right. It's not the same kind of meaning as like ritual burials, but it certainly is meaning nonetheless. And then as it sort of progresses, you get things like ritual burials, which is fascinating because there would have to be, maybe not have to, but I would think that there is some abstract thinking that has to go on. And by abstract, it's like internal representation.
Yeah.
Beyond just informational processing.
Yeah.
And that you're aware of that.
Yeah.
Moreover, right? Because there has to be some sort of line of reasoning or of logic or whatever you want to call it, of saying, okay, well, I don't like that this person has died. And beyond that, what happens to dead bodies is they get ravaged by mites and animals and things like that. And that doesn't feel right. And I have the capacity to do something about it. As a group, maybe it's better to think of it that way, because individually it's quite difficult. Usually, otherwise they'll just hide it somewhere or whatever. But I guess the burial part takes it to a different level.
Yes.
Of like actually taking time to think it through, to be like, well, we're putting this person back in the ground, right? And
Well, I think
and then you can attach all kinds of things to that, of like the return to the earth and whatever else you want.
Well, I think the other big thing that's involved there, which I go into in the chapter on identity, is the fact that because I can talk to you, I have a very clear sense of who you are, and a memory of you as an individual in the way you thought and what you did and all those things. So you're not just like a roadkill at the side of the road. It's like, oh my God, that's Shane. I remember Shane, and it's like his spirit. The idea of the soul, which seems to be such a deep-rooted idea in all cultures. As far back as we can go, and the simplest cultures now still living in hunter-gatherer type environments, the soul is a very key concept for them, and it's not difficult to see how language contributes to that. And so once you have the idea of the soul as a separate identity, that somehow the body dies but the soul, maybe we need to take care of that, so that maybe there's a journey the whole religious tradition of thinking about why are we here, what's this all about, what happens to us, where did we come from, where do we go to, all those questions arise once you have a certain level of sophistication in language, and I think they inevitably do. And you read my chapter on religion, that sort of explores how that might have, or logically would occur, because it's about logic, really. Other animals that don't have language have logic. Your dogs have logic. I'm sure you've seen them sort of kind of figuring stuff out. And it's that, again, we're back to the brain as a pattern recognition device. That's what it is. The only question is, how many tools do you have to help the brain do that? And words are just a way of bringing to consciousness little bits of that reality that you're aware of, and allowing you to play with them. And part of that playing with them is asking questions. It's like, how do we divide up time? Why are we here? Why am I suffering? And who am I? And all those things. These are questions that occur naturally with language.
Absolutely, and I guess the logic in animals we sort of loosely refer to as instinct.
Yeah.
Right. Followed patterns of behavior that are, to at least a large degree, genetically ingrained. Right, and we can look at epigenetics as well to sort of think about how you can learn and pass on without actually teaching, which is fascinating, but a little bit sidetracked. But
I think
the religious.
Just to very quickly pick on that, in terms of instinct, I talk about that as well. That because you don't have a head full of other people's words and other thoughts going on in your head to influence you. The sense of your feeling of what's right, or what we mean by instinct, you instinctively do something, is much clearer to you. But in terms of the actual logical process, something I've been observing, that we have a squirrel in our garden, which we have a constant fight with. I have a bird feeder, and I'm trying to find a way to keep that out of his way so that he can't get into the bird feeder before the birds do. And I have tried every which way to, put it out of his reach. And I can see him coming along, and just every time I do something new, he's just looking at it, he's going over it, he's figuring it out. That's not that. I guess it's instinct to the extent that I want the food, but you can see his mind working on it. It's like, if I do this, maybe then I could get it that way. If I climb up there, it's a fascinating study of just how smart animals actually are. They really are. They've got the equipment, they just don't have the ability to communicate it.
Right. And that makes sense, right? Because they do that. They do sort of problem solve, but not in the same way that we do it.
Well, actually,
or maybe in the same way.
I think it is the same way. It's just that we have a more sophisticated means of using other people's ideas as well as our own,
And perhaps understanding of it.
Yes.
Right, because we have this sort of metacognitive ability to think about our thoughts.
Right. But that is words. That's what words brought to the game. If we didn't have words, we wouldn't have that ability. words are what allow us to stand back from what we're thinking. And you're probably thinking, as you referred to earlier, about abstract concepts like something, let's say justice, for example. I mean, justice is a kind of fairly sophisticated concept, and we're thinking, well, only humans have the concept of justice. But I don't know, your two dogs probably fight over what they consider to be the right amount of food that they should get, and the other one's got more or something. You know, that animals have a sense of justice, for example, but they don't have a concept of justice. That's just something that they feel. Whereas because we're able to, and again, these words, just as when you're learning a foreign language yourself, you don't get to the word justice till you've probably got quite a way down, the vocabulary path, not to mention grammar. And I suspect it would be exactly the same for early humans. I mean, it's abstract concepts are take quite a while to develop, but I don't think it's something. Well, to the extent that we have larger brains, obviously we have more firepower now than our chimpanzee cousins. But it's the language that gives us the ability to sort things out, to be aware that we're aware.
Right, and what's interesting about the sort of abstract concepts part is that we're not even very good at that. I mean, we're a lot better than perhaps we have been, but fundamentally being articulate is very difficult, right? And there is great power in being articulate.
Yes.
And anyone knows this, right? I mean, speech is compelling and it's powerful and it's attractive rather. And that's why, people who speak well and articulate authentically, they draw attention, right? There's something that's in us that moves towards it. And it's not an easy skill to learn. And, it's interesting to think about how, like, the concept of, when you were speaking about justice, I sort of think of Socrates. And he was like, or maybe it was Plato, but whatever. In the work of Socrates, the whole thing was about what is justice. And no one could really define it.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone could give you an example of, oh, well, this is how justice looks like, or this is an example of justice.
Right.
But justice itself is very difficult to define, and yet everyone kind of knows what it is. Now, we might not agree upon definitions, but we all have a sense of what is just and what is unjust.
Yes.
And that still applies very much to all sorts of things, right? Like one of the most difficult things for people to conceptualize and articulate is emotions.
Right.
Right?
Sure.
You can describe the biological processes of it, or the sort of symptoms and the hormones and the chemicals and the reactions, and you can describe the causal relations of, like, well, this seems to cause this, and you have this emotional experience. You can correlate different people's experiences to find out what's common amongst them.
Yeah.
But it's really actually difficult. Well, firstly, it's impossible to articulate, I think, phenomenology, right? Like, that's one of the big problems, is you can't describe experience.
The qualia, as is known in the genre, yeah.
And I think it's absolutely right. And for anyone who sort of hasn't really heard that, it's like the classic thought experiment that they talk about is, imagine someone's born into a room that has been constructed that is made out of black and white and gray materials only. And that's all they're ever exposed to, right? And throughout this person's life, they're taught everything there is to know about color in black and white, though. So the scientific understanding of it, the spectrum, the color spectrum of wavelengths of light, everything like that. And then all of a sudden, one day, you bring in a red ball, right? Will this person know that this is red? Or will they not know what color it is, just that it's different from the black and white?
Right.
And following that, the line is like, okay, well, then there's some knowledge in experience that you can't get from not having the experience.
Sure.
Right.
Yes. I mean, it is, everything is experientially based. And interestingly, just since you mentioned color, there's quite a lot of literature about the evolution of color words. And the order in which they evolved, and they didn't all just spring out one day and somebody goes, oh look, there's a rainbow, let's just name all those different colors. It didn't happen like that at all. It was black and white generally seem to be the first words that occur, and maybe it's just light and shade, that would sort of seem an obvious distinction. And then red appears to be one of the first colors, and again blood, that's something that would sort of be very commonly observed. You'd think green would be, but apparently that doesn't seem to be high up on the list. But there's a sort of a timeline, and it does depend on the cultures, but people have done studies and looking at it, and it's very clear that they didn't all appear at once. And it's a sort of you can have the experience before you can have the words to describe it. I mean, that's slightly different to what you're talking about. You're talking about more abstractly about having the knowledge of something without the experience, and would you recognize it when you saw it if you only had the abstract knowledge? I don't know. Maybe teenagers go through that. They have the abstract knowledge, and then suddenly one day, they have the knowledge.
Yeah. No, listen. What you're saying is right. I mean, we have tons of experiences that we can't explain or know, right? And typically we don't think about them that much, other than perhaps to re-experience them mentally, or maybe mentally is too limited, but at least psychophysiologically maybe is the right word. You remember a moment of love or of connection or of hatred or of something like that, and it's very difficult to describe, but you had that experience and that you can remember it experientially. And so I wonder if the evolution of color changed with how our eyes evolved, right? Like, I wonder if it was sort of concurrent evolution in terms of like our increased ability to see color.
I doubt it. I think they know, well, in terms of color vision, as you know, we can only see three colors. It's like red, blue, and green. And those give, the combinations of those give rise to all the colors that we can see. And I think we know specifically the gene that did it, and I think it's several tens of millions of years back in time that we acquired that ability. Something to do with seeing ripe fruit or something was the need to see. But in terms of your specific question about the evolution of vocabulary, I think you just have to think about your own experience in a new field, something that you are interested in, you become interested in, and you don't know the words for it. I mean, take architecture. You can walk down a street, and as a child, it's a building, a building. I knew a door, a window, a roof. That was about it. And then as you become interested in it, and the history of architecture, for example, you learn all, the fancy words like architrave and pediment and all these things. They were there the whole time, and you saw them, but you didn't actually need to discuss them with anybody because you weren't particularly interested. And I think it's more likely that that's the case. It's a question of how much attention do you need to pay to any given aspect of reality, because it is or isn't important to you. The stuff that you will have a specialist field, I'm sure, that you can talk about that I have no idea what you're talking about, and vice versa. So it's not about not having the capacity to do it. It's about not having had the reason to pay attention to it, maybe.
Yeah, and also the a field of knowledge to draw from. Yeah. In the times that we're in, right? Yes. Like, you could learn it and discover all those things if there were no knowledge already existing about the architecture, right? Right. And we're constantly on a journey of discovery as a human species into every little thing that we can find. Absolutely. There are a bunch of people trying to figure it out.
Not to mention in creating our own reality, the metaverse and everything that's going to go with that, all those aspects of dealing with a completely new artificial reality that we've created ourselves. So.
Yeah, I mean, and the whole, I mean, we have just no idea what's going to come with that. I mean, we don't even have a good idea of how technology is influencing us right now. because it happens faster than we're able to even think about it.
That's right.
I mean, people have ideas and theories, and there's lots of good experiments being done to prove stuff, but there's by no means definitive answers to anything. And given the diversity of humanity and the human experience, there's almost never going to be a unified theory of anything. There's just too much complication and difference.
Well, there's too much for us to be able to process, but maybe not too much for artificial intelligence to process in the future. I mean, that's kind of Ray Kurzweil's point about the singularity. That there's going to be a point coming, and it's maybe even in our lifetimes. Well, in yours, maybe not mine, but when we get to the point where AI is smarter than us, and that's then all bets are off, because they're going to be calculating stuff that is accurately correct, and they can then take actions based on that, and we're not going to know why. And in a way, that to me is what happened when we invented language, when humans invented language. It's like you've got to a point where when animals look at humans, they must have absolutely no idea what we're doing. I mean, they see it, but they have no conception. Maybe it doesn't really bother them because they're not even thinking about that. But in terms of the difference between having language and not having language, it's like the difference between having AI that is way smarter than us and not having it. It's like a phase change. It's going to be an astonishing thing when it happens. Quite scary, actually.
Yeah, a little bit scary for the humans, I suppose. It's good for the machines, and many sci-fi tales have prophesied such a future, and that may or may not be true. I mean, we don't know. And some people think that that's good enough reason to not go down that route, but there's no stopping it at this point.
Exactly, you can't not go down that route. When the route is there, you can't not go down it. That's the thing.
Yeah, because someone will do it.
Yeah.
Right. You just need one person, theoretically. I mean, it's a lot of one people, but it's a chain. But I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of government or control exists.
It's like genetic engineering. It's going to happen. People are going to be doing it.
And as long as the internet is available, then there's no stopping it either.
That's right.
I mean, what would stop it, I suppose, is like a solar flare or a mass extinction event. But that would more likely just slow it down for a few thousand or hundreds of thousands of years. And then there's some people who think that, I mean, it's a little bit sort of like fantastical that sort of like the purpose of humanity is to reach the point of, giving birth to the machines and to artificial intelligence, so to speak. And I mean, that's more of a sort of afterthought more than anything else. I don't really subscribe to that.
Yeah, it's not really so much artificial intelligence. It's artificial in the sense that we will have created the vehicles for that intelligence to express itself. But it's partly because we don't think of ourselves as being artificial, but we are artificial. I mean, language is an artificial device for conveying hints to what we're experiencing. I mean, you just talked about the difficulty of actually really closing down on what you mean by anger or happiness or justice or any of those things, but we're able to approximate that because we have a sense of it. But language is an artificial intelligence already in that sense. I'm drawing on the resources of hundreds of thousands of years of human knowledge when I'm speaking to you. So it's not just me anymore. I'm talking with the voice of human history. So that's artificial, already. So by pushing it into another level, because our brains can't get smarter physically, we cannot evolve our brains to be smarter in the amount of time required to take on board what we're developing right now. So we have no alternative but to create an artificial kind of device that will allow intelligence to get smarter. But it's not really artificial. It's just allowing intelligence to do what it's going to do, which is to connect up and make more connections. That's really all it is.
Yeah, the distinction between natural and artificial is it's silly. I mean, I understand where it comes from, but you don't look at. We look at things like buildings and concrete as artificial creations, right? But you don't look at the analogy I use is you don't look at a beehive and say, oh, well, the bee, that's an artificial creation. You're like, no, the bees made it out of other shit. And, it's the same thing. And the difference between us and machines is we're biological machines.
Exactly.
And maybe they're mechanical machines. But these are just ways we think about it. But fundamentally, there will be physical under structures that give rise to intelligence, let's say, right? It's kind of like the problem of the hard problem of the mind and of consciousness is like, well, does the brain and everything else that goes with it explain consciousness, or is consciousness more like an epiphenomenon where it happens sort of outside of but inextricably linked to the brain? It's kind of like another analogy is like the software on your computer, right?
Yeah.
You have a set of hardware materials that on their own are useless, but you put them all together, you pump some electricity in there, you write some code, and all of a sudden you have virtually a living thing.
Right.
In terms of it can do its own thing. I mean, you've programmed it to, but so is your brain programmed. It's not that different.
Well, that's what culture is as well.
It can learn things. Exactly, yeah.
Culture is a huge, great program of information. I mean, that's what education is. It's about downloading the software, literally that. I mean, that's why it's so important, because you need to have all this information to function in a society that depends on that knowledge. And it's like units of software being downloaded, just in the same way.
And they're not even always good. They're just functional.
Yeah. And have accidentally just sort of been found to work, and we just hang on to them in that form because we know it works, and we're not willing to change because we're very conservative by nature.
Yeah, except the few who aren't, right? Yeah. Who challenge the conservative view and get often shunned by society for that, and then come back with all this new information that they found on their own because they didn't subscribe to the conservative view of things, but they exist in a balance, because if all of society went progressive, not politically, just morally, I don't know, intellectually, it would be chaos, because there'd be no structure and no order, and everyone would just be doing their own thing. There wouldn't be culture. It would be anarchy. But at the same time, when it becomes overly conservative and there's no room for growth, then things start to crumble, because life is constantly changing, and things need to evolve to the changing times. And I mean, you see that reflected in our political domain quite easily.
Absolutely.
But
the thing is, we're now, but we're now at a point where, I mean, everything you just said applies within any society, no matter how small. You start out with a tribe, and the tribe accidentally, or luckily, or perhaps intelligently, works out various ways of doing things. They become the tradition, and then, as you just said, that some person wants to do it differently, and they're ostracized, and in the extreme case, they have to go off and set up their own tribe, maybe. So through history, that's the process of splitting up into different cultures. Essentially, is people have gone off and done their own thing because they weren't accepted within their own societies. But we're now at the point where everybody is interconnected. I mean, this is a very new point for the world. I mean, it's maybe been 100 years now that we've had the capacity to talk around the world with people, but nothing like now. I mean, just the fact that what you and I are doing now is incredible. I mean, when I was a kid, the idea that you could do this. Well, it existed in science fiction, but that's about it, and now it's just like the most normal thing in the world. And that's just going to increase. So, the capacity, I mean, in a way, the overarching structure of the book is really about that. It's about how intelligence just sort of came together through language, and it's taken us to this point where we're now a single globe, and we have to figure out how to do this without destroying ourselves, which we're teetering on the edge of doing in Ukraine, by the way, That's that.
Yeah. And we probably will be in various forms for who knows how long, because, I mean, any society that gets sufficiently large, it has a lot of problems, right? It's the Tower of Babel in the Bible. It's kind of like you build up too high and then there's too much disagreement and then it just doesn't work. I mean, it's not an exact... I'm not saying the Tower of Babel is a literal historical fact.
In the case of the Tower of Babel, it was God that got angry. It's like, hey, you guys are getting too much like me.
But if you think... I think about it more or less... I mean, I think about it less than like, well, God was angry, and more just like a result of the sort of workings that are far beyond our current comprehension, right? And it's sort of like a manifestation of human nature that may change, but sort of at that point in time, and, I'm sure some would argue still really relatively relevant today, it's like, this is how humans behave in these sorts of situations. It's like a more of a moral
Except the argument I make in my last chapter, which I think is kind of relevant to what's going on now in Ukraine particularly, is that what's happened through history, if we're talking about how humans behave and what is human nature and so forth, we've obviously spent most of certainly history and probably a lot of prehistory fighting each other, over resources. In a way, that's the basic evolutionary thing. It's the struggle for existence. Somebody's got something you need, you're going to fight them for it if you can't negotiate. And that's really the issue, is how do you get to the point where you don't need to fight or you don't have to fight? And that's an issue particularly now because we can't. The fact of atomic weapons, nuclear bombs, means that we cannot go to war in the traditional sense of using every means at our disposal. I can't, because to start nuclear war is
mutually assured destruction.
Game over, right? It's game over. So where do we go? Well, what's happened within most countries with a long history is that they've gone from a period of warring states, where different parts of the regions of the country have been fighting over who controls the country, be that in China, Japan, Britain, Europe, all over Europe. Countries that we know about with the long histories of war have finally come together either through conquest or through a negotiated peace, where they then take decisions that are made and they resolve conflict using words, not using the violence. So, I mean, if you and I happen to be living next to each other, which we're not, and you claimed a piece of my garden and said it was yours, or vice versa, we could have an argument about it and we could have a fight about it. And if you're stronger than me or vice versa, then I could just take it. But we've resolved a mechanism for dealing with that. So the police will come in and separate us. And then we go to a place where you make your argument and I make my argument, and it's decided by a jury or a judge. That's accepted now within most democratic countries, that's how you deal with it. And we now need to take that to the next level. We have to go to the point. I mean, why is Russia just moving into Ukraine? Because they have a grievance. Well, they think they have a grievance. So there ought to be a forum where that grievance can be heard, and it can be heard in a jury of its peers, and a decision made as to what is the rightful thing to do. And we do have that forum. It's called the United Nations. But it ain't working right now because, the veto and various other things I go to in the book. But in terms of where we're going with this, in terms of how history has been, it's gone from a small series of interlocking tribes and cultures to a large. You go to towns, states, countries, and now we're one globe. But the principle is the same. We have to figure it out. We have to work out how to live without violence. And we either do that or we destroy ourselves. I think that's about where we are right now. It's an interesting moment of history.
Yeah, particularly because of the violent capacity of our current technology, right?
Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective, democracy has always been the sort of pinnacle of political sort of systems that we know of, or that we've got available.
It's the least bad option.
Exactly.
I think we can say
now, it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
And it's subject to all kinds of problems. I mean, even the jury of the peers problem, right? It's like, well, Socrates was executed by popular demand of 500 of jurors, right, for corrupting the youth. I don't know why I keep bringing up Socrates. It's just, I don't have an obsession with him. It's come up twice now. And so it's like, well, that was 2.5 or whatever thousand years ago.
Sure.
And it's like, well, we're still at that point, right? It's like there's chaos, and there's never unanimity, or there's rarely unanimity in a jury. And it's like, well, because we have biases and we have preferences and we have different ideas of how we should live and how the government should control things. And, so there's never going to be, well, I don't know about never, but it's hard for me to imagine how there could ever be true peace in the sense of a utopian peace.
Oh, well, there won't
I don't think that's possible.
No, there's always going to be conflict. The question is, how do you deal with conflict? And
right.
For example, in my country, we had this referendum, and we decided that the majority decided they wanted to leave Europe. I mean, there's an argument about whether it was truly democratic and blah blah blah, but essentially, the majority said we're out. Now, a lot of people, including myself, think that was not a very clever decision, and that we might have to revisit it at some point. But the point is, it did happen. It was the decision of the majority, and you just got to live with that. And unless you then start a new political movement yourself, saying, "Well, I think we should rejoin," and eventually enough people agree with you, and you can reverse it. And it's the same with a court decision or anything else. You're never going to get everybody going, "Yeah, we all agree." That's not going to happen. The question is, what do you do when you don't agree? Do you fight until the stronger one wins? Or do you use the force of argument to persuade people and decide it on intellectual grounds? I mean, we're right back to what I said at the beginning. It's like being smart is evolutionarily sort of, it's something that evolution can select for because it gives you more opportunities than if you just went down to, well, who's strongest here? Because if it's just the survival of the fittest physically, then intelligence doesn't get a chance.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, I think you're right. And it's also, by the metrics that have been gathered, right, we live in a time of more peace and less war than there's ever been in human history, despite the fact that it doesn't feel like it.
It's because we're living in it.
Yeah. But that progression is continuing, despite the problems and conflicts that are going on and that will go on in different ways and whatever. But it's a matter of progress, of reduction of violence, right? And we live in a society, at least first world societies, even third world societies, but maybe to a less degree, where violence is just an absolutely non-optional approach on an individual level, right? Yeah. Like, it is just not tolerated. Yeah. Assault is a real criminal charge, and you will go to jail for it. They will lock you in a cage if you put your hands on someone. Yeah. And it's a remarkable accomplishment. And
it is.
Sure, it comes with complications and whatever, but I mean, the fact that that's rarely a thing is quite remarkable. And I've also thought, I mean, like, the Russia-Ukraine situation is just, it's tragic, right? It's a despicable situation. But what it all, especially in the beginning, I noticed when it first started happening, I noticed that listen, I'm not very old, so I don't know about beforehand, but it seemed that there was never quite a unification globally about two other countries' affairs. Right now, I'm sure there have been lots of global things, and the social media and the internet have fueled the capacity to join things and whatever. And there's lots of influential factors, but this sort of like colonialist approach of like, we're going to take what we want by force has been met with fierce resistance from the whole world, basically. Maybe minus one or two because of political bullshit, but
but the reason for that
now, but the problem is like, well, Russia has 500 or 5,000 nuclear warheads, right? So it's not exactly like the world can just say no, but I mean, we're talking about like a very interesting dispute, whereas 200 years ago, if one country wanted another country, they would just take it by force, and everyone would be like, okay, that's your country now.
Well, we're back to strength. I mean, as you said, it's a remarkable achievement that we've achieved that on an individual basis, and that is entirely down to the power of words. Mm-hmm. We just need to scale that up. I mean, we've kind of done it to the level of countries in most of the so-called Western world. They're not fighting each other. If there's an issue, there's something, there's a democratic resolution to it. But the thing the particularly worrying thing for me now about the way Ukraine is being talked about is that we're saying, well, okay, Putin's actions are illegal, and that is true, but the only reason that they are illegal, because as you just said, in the last few hundred years, it's like you want something, you take it. That's not illegal, it's just what you did. So why is what Putin doing now illegal? And the only reason is because of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. There's no other reason. So if we're saying, okay, well, NATO should be doing more, NATO should go in, NATO should stop Putin. There's no more reason for NATO to go in and stop Putin than there is for Putin to not go in, and that's just war. That is war. Mm-hmm. Now, through the United Nations, we agreed that we're not going to do that. We agreed that everybody signed up, including Russia, signed up to the idea that you do not invade a sovereign country. That's just against the rules. It's like you do not assault somebody. You don't do it. Now, it's taken long enough for us to figure out that assault really is something that we don't tolerate. And it's probably going to take a lot longer for us to work out that we don't invade countries. And we haven't got the mechanism, as you said, for doing it, except if we were to take a vote. Well, they did take a vote in the UN basically saying Russia has broken the rules. And we demand that they withdraw, but there's no force behind that. But if we were to say through the United Nations, okay, we've agreed that you should be out, democratically a decision, you should get out of Ukraine, then we should have a police force, and we should basically say, and if you don't, we'll take you out. Now, you can say, oh, but he's got nuclear weapons, and yes, he does, but he knows too, or maybe he doesn't, but his guys know, that if they use their nuclear weapons, they're dead too. So there is an argument for saying maybe we should, if we went through the United Nations, he would have to acknowledge that it was a legal thing to take him on. Whereas if we go as part of NATO and just sort of sneakily add in lethal aid and do that, that's war, And there's it's you can say, it's just words, but words are what count, in the end. Language is what makes us human,
Exactly. And, well, I mean, the UN would need an army, right? And the most powerful army in the world, technically speaking, because, because you just take Putin as an example. I mean, it could be anyone, right? And it will be other people in the future because humans are problematic. And I'm not saying Putin is this or isn't, but, you'll get psychopathic humans, you'll get deranged people who lust for power and violence, and and that comes for all sorts of reasons, like abuse and culture and history and whatever. Power for the sake of having power and
Yeah.
where that leads to the corruption of it.
Well, it's not even just
and
that.
it's
It
like,
can be ideological. I mean, the next thing, if we don't sort out, well, even if we do, but, coming down the line of this is Taiwan and China. That's not necessarily just about a lust for power. That's more of an ideological thing for them. It's like, this is one country. This is our country, so.
But isn't Putin viewing it the same way? Isn't he trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union?
In a way, he is.
I mean, I don't know. It's just what I've heard, right?
Yeah, well, he may, whatever is in his head, the fact of the matter is that Ukraine is a sovereign country and was one of the founder members of the UN. And he has no right to do that. And he's signed a legal agreement saying that he won't do that. So that is, excuse me, that actually is the way you can use words. I mean, in the last chapter of my book, I talk about Martin Luther King and his, when he came to Washington and made that speech about "I have a dream," about the world actually respecting other the black issue particularly. But the point was that he didn't just say, "I have a dream. I wish you wouldn't do this to us." He said, "You've actually agreed not to do it." And he said, "I hold in my hand a check issued to me in the name of the United States government, which is the Constitution, which says that all men shall be treated equal." So he had an actual legal case, and that was really the thing that pushed that forward. I mean, you can say, how much forward has it come? But it has. I mean, things are definitely improved in America than they were in the 60s in terms of, racial relations. Long way to go, but they have got better. And to the extent that they have, it's because it was a legal challenge that he made on the basis of the Constitution. So that's why laws are kind of important. So we have the United Nations Charter. That is a law that we've all signed up on. So we need to just make it work, and that may take some time, but that's got to be the direction of travel for the world if there is going to be a future for us.
Right, because laws are fundamentally just agreements that you make and sign up to as a society, and I mean, you'll have a hard time finding somewhere that doesn't have laws and influencing them, but it happens, and it usually happens through big movements, right? Lots of people, big societies, and if you don't agree to them, then collectively as a society, we've arranged, well, that you're either going to agree to this law and abide by it, let's say, rather. You don't have to morally agree with it, but you have to respect and abide by it, or there will be consequences.
Yes.
And then we can debate about what those consequences should be and whether it's fair, and a lot of it isn't, and it's very complicated. But a government has, any given government basically has a monopoly on violence in the country, right? They say, we're allowed to use violence on you to enforce our laws.
Yeah.
That sounds a bit dramatic, but that's really kind of how it is.
That is it, yeah.
But everyone signs up to it. Or at least passively agrees, right? But then you get a situation like Putin, where he's like, "What you gonna do?" He's like, "Yeah, I agree to it, but so what? What you gonna do?" And there's nothing we can do at the moment.
Yes, but if we then just say, "Oh, well, there's nothing we can do, so we'll just let him do it," then what?
Oh no, listen, I don't think we should just let him. I don't have any real answers. I'm by no means educated in this subject, and I don't know what should be done. I honestly have no idea, and I wish something was and could be done, and I sort of want to believe that people are doing the best that they can, and maybe it's not good enough, or maybe it is. I don't know, but that's sort of just my assessment of how he's looking at the situation.
Yeah, and I think this is essentially, rather sadly, probably going to be the best strategy to do, which is just incrementally just wear it down and wear it down and wear it down until either he's dead or somebody's killed him or gives up, which seems unlikely. But the point is, it's not something that we can just solve at a stroke, but over and above that, the overarching thing for me is, are we doing this on behalf of who? Are we doing this? Are we doing this because we just don't want him to do it? The West doesn't like Russia pushing us around, or are we doing it because we have all agreed that we're not going to do this? And to me, that's a higher level to take this. And the debate has to go there eventually. It may not go there now. We may not be ready for it. But in terms of how do we deal in the future with violence in the world, it has to be that. And maybe we have to face it down at some point and go, okay, you've got nuclear weapons, but if you don't get out, we're going to hit you with what we need to take you out. And if you use nuclear weapons, then you're out too. So we're all out. And really, you're going to do that? I just don't think somehow that the entire Russian army is prepared to commit suicide, which is what it would be. But
yeah, or at least the sort of 3 people needed to make that decision.
Exactly. Right? That's right.
Which is a scarily low number of people. But in any country, that's pretty much how it is. But I mean, idealistically speaking, right, it's like, well, the discussion is about humanity, right? We're not talking, I mean, we are talking about Ukraine, obviously, but as you say, that the broader perspective, which maybe will come more into focus once the conflict is over, one way or another, it's about humanity and how we as a globe deal with things. And I mean, if anyone could just switch a button and say, okay, well, in order to do this, maybe what needs to happen is the UN or some big board of people need to have a monopoly on global violence and can enforce rules however they see fit. And that'll come with problems, obviously, and corruption is everywhere. But maybe at some point humanity will try that. And maybe it'll work and maybe it won't.
Maybe it doesn't need to go that far. As I explore in my final chapter there, I mean, it's essentially, we have already been in this situation once before. People don't really know this anymore. But
the Cold War.
No, earlier than that. Well, it was during the Cold War, but I was thinking of the Suez Crisis. When Britain and France decided they wanted to take the Suez Canal back from Egypt, who had nationalized it since it was in their land, and that, so they persuaded Israel to be the instrument to do that. Israel comes in and starts taking over the Suez Canal. There's fighting going on. There's a meeting of the UN Security Council, and basically they decide you stop doing this. And Britain and France, both being nuclear powers, of course, said, we're going to use our veto, just like Russia said it was going to use its veto when they debated Ukraine originally. And so then what happened is that they took the decision out from the Security Council to the General Assembly, which means that everybody could vote on it. And there's a mechanism for doing that, and it's called the Uniting for Peace Resolution. You'll have to look it up. But it's basically, they did that again for Ukraine. So in the Security Council, you have a veto, which means that unless everybody agrees, you can't do anything. But in the General Assembly, it becomes a democratic decision. So what happened in Suez was that they decided that the democratic decision of the UN was that France and Britain and Israel should butt out, basically. And having decided that, they then said, the Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, said, right, in order for that to happen, we need to have an emergency force that's prepared to do this. So hands up, guys, who's going to do it? And 11 countries put their hands up and said, we're prepared to commit military force to this. And just the threat of that, even though Britain and France had nuclear weapons and could have used them, just the threat of that was enough to make them back off. Mm-hmm. Now, I have a feeling that might work in the future too, and that you don't need a UN army as such. All you need, and in fact it would be kind of dangerous and destabilizing in a way. I mean, every country is going to need to have some form of military force as the backup for its own police system. But if you've got a functioning UN where decisions can be made internationally about whether a particular conflict is legal or justified or not, then just like with a police force, if the decision is no, back off, then you can just go, right, that's it, we're going to have an emergency force, and who's going to do it? And that could be done in Ukraine. We could say, right, emergency force, who's going to do it? It's going to be NATO. Obviously, it's going to be NATO. They're the only ones who really have the power to do it. But doing it as NATO and doing it as the UN are two very different things, legally speaking, because one is war, as we were saying earlier, and the other is a police action. And if we accept that the police have a righteous power within any given society to enforce the laws, then the same principle applies internationally, or should do. And we will get there, but maybe not just tomorrow,
Yeah, slowly. And I think the other problem that we'd have to figure out is how, I mean, this is more of in my opinion, a grassroots approach of like, well, how do we not have people in those positions making strategic decisions that benefit themselves more than what's the right thing to do, right? Is maybe one way of saying it. Like, I don't know the details of the Suez Canal situation, but I can imagine that lots of countries were voting because it influenced them in one way or another, and they wanted to have it influence them for the better, and so they're voting for that reason, and not the reason of like, oh well, it's Egypt's property, that's theirs. It's a different problem. That's a human
problem.
moral
That
problem.
that applies right across the board, that people
of
make
course,
decisions based. I mean, but that's what democracy is. Democracy is like how many people agree for one reason or another that we're going to do this as opposed to that. So we're not all pure, we're not all saints. It's never going to be. It's always going to be messy, but it's always.
And every institution is subject to corruption, right?
Yeah, but it's always going to be better than having one guy just saying, "You do it the way I say, or I'm going to kill you, or torture you, or do whatever else." That it's got to be a better solution than that.
Yeah. Well, listen, Simon, this has been a fantastic podcast, so thank you. Where can people buy your book? Please promote anything that you would like.
I'm afraid you're going to have to go to Amazon, but your local bookstore should be able to order it for you, because I have some kind of distribution deal that I don't know about. But the easiest and quickest way is to go to Amazon and just look for Speech, How Language Made Us Human, and that should take you to it. Yeah,
and I highly recommend it. Or you can Google Simon Prentis and that'll come up. But I'll have the links in the description as well.
My website, yeah. Prentis spelled Prentis. Only one S.
Right.
No C.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yeah, let's do it. It would be nice.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.